millimeters. And that doesn't include our peripheral vision, what we can see over here on the left and right. But 50 millimeters is sort of what my focal area is, or my field of view that I can distinguish things in. And that's why the 50 millimeter prime lens is a very popular lens in photography, as well as the 35 millimeter, because there's some gray area there as to whether humans can actually see 35 field of view or 50 field of view. All right, so those lenses tend to be very popular, and they were popular back in the film days as well because of the particular field of view that a human eye can see. All right. He also mentioned one other quick thing in the video that I thought was interesting. I was trying to do the math here, but my math is not very good. He talked about an iPhone, and he talked about the field of view on an iPhone. Do you remember what he said? What did he mention? Did anybody take a note on that? What was
17
the
millimeters, 17 mm.
17 millimeters? You're right. So he talked about the iPhone field of view, and basically 17 millimeters is what he was saying. That was the equivalent if you were to have a lens on a micro four thirds camera. Now, remember, there is a crop factor. I haven't gotten into this lesson yet. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but I was trying to do the math, and I don't know if this is exactly right. I'll have to look this up, but I figured out that if you had a lens on a full frame sensor camera, that would actually equate to about a 23 or 24 millimeter lens. So a little bit less field of view than what he was talking about, but depending on the type of camera you put, that lens on, it would determine that field. But 24 is still considered kind of wide. You can see here on this chart that anything from say 28 millimeter all the way down to a fisheye lens would be considered a wide angle lens, right? So this blue zone right here, this gives me a very extreme field of view. So the iPhone was made to basically have a large field of view, much like a lot of other phones like the Android and the Google. They're all going to have something that's going to be equivalent to maybe 24 to 17 millimeters, on that. And I know a lot of the newer phones have the multiple lenses, right? That has 3 lenses on there. And one of those lenses is a zoom lens. And I think another one is a super wide lens. So they're actually giving you a lot more range of adjustment than the old iPhones like mine, which is an old iPhone 7, and it only has a single lens. So this one here is probably more equivalent to the 17 to 24 millimeter field of view on this one. I can zoom in a little bit, but it's more of what they call a digital zoom. And I'm not sure I mentioned that in the video here, but I just want to mention that some cameras have what's called a digital zoom, and then they have an optical zoom. So what happens is that let's say your camera has an optical zoom of say 3 times the focal length. So if you had a 25 millimeter lens, then if you were 3 times that, that would take you to 75 millimeters, right, in the optical zoom. But then they'll say, oh, but then you've got 3 times digital zoom. What does that actually do? Well, inside the camera and the software, it will actually simulate if you were zooming in 3 times more, but it basically does it by cropping the photo. So in my experience of using the digital zoom inside of a lot of new cameras, it doesn't look that great. So it depends on your camera. I mean, they've improved the software a little bit, but I would recommend being really careful if you have a camera that has optical zoom and then it goes to digital zoom. Try to stay out of that digital zoom area, because basically all it's doing is zoom, it's cropping in your photo to make the subject appear closer, but you're not technically getting the full resolution of that sensor. A lot of small point and shoot cameras or the smaller compact cameras have that feature, that digital zoom feature, right? So just remember, it's not an actual optical zoom, which has to do with moving the lens elements further apart from each other to get the actual zoom. It's doing it inside with the software, right? And sometimes it can look okay, but a lot of times it just doesn't look that great. And that's what the iPhone kind of has. It has that digital zoom. So when you zoom in, like with your fingers on the iPhone, it tends to make things look a little pixelated and blurry. It's just not that great, right? Because it doesn't have the actual lenses inside to create that focal length. All right. Any quick questions before we play this and move on? All right. I'm going to go ahead and play this then. makes a lens, a zoom lens versus a wide angle lens versus a prime lens and so on. And I'm also going to talk about some of the markings on the outside of the lens so that you can kind of understand what those things are. Now, what I first want to mention is that a lot of my students will ask me, how can I get sharper images in my photography, or how can I get clearer images in my photography? We've talked a lot about the sensor of the camera being one of the most important things, but I would have to say that the lens is probably going to be your second most important thing. It's part of the system. The lens is what actually allows us to see the objects. So if we have a lens that doesn't have very good optical clarity in the elements of the lens, then we are going to get that in our images as well. So having a higher quality lens with better quality optics and glass is going to increase our sharpness, our clarity, the types of colors and hues that we can see, and also it'll affect the dynamic range slightly as well. So a lens is very important. So I have this handout here that I created. I wasn't sure if I'd given it to you previously because I didn't have it marked off the list. But I'm going to include it in today's lesson. So just download it. It'll be a PDF. And this will talk about the difference between, wide angle lenses versus standard lenses and versus zoom lenses. And I've got the markings over here that show you that. And I've also got some examples down here of the difference between 70 millimeters versus 105 versus 200 versus 400. So I've got these examples here. Now, what is this actual measurement here, and why is it in millimeters? And that's what I'm going to go over today, all right? So this is called our field of view, our FOV. All right, so let's jump over here to this document that I created. Now, I created one previously, but I watched it and it had a bunch of old stuff in there, so I decided just to redo this whole thing and try to explain these things a little bit more clearly. All right, so field of view. Field of view is basically what we can see when we look through the lens. So the amount I can see from left to right, that's my field of view, okay? Now, if you read up about this, you'll understand that the human eye has an equivalent field of view of about 50 millimeters. So if we were to put a 50 millimeter lens on our full frame camera, then we would be basically seeing what the human eye sees, not including our peripheral vision. Now, our peripheral vision, obviously, I can see things like way over here on the side or way over here, but I can't really focus on them, right? I see them, but I'm not in the focus zone. So the human eye has a 50 millimeter equivalent field of view focus zone, not including, our peripheral vision over here. All right. So now that we've established that, let's take a look at a few of these things here. So when I'm looking through the lens of my camera, I'm seeing the width, the area here, right, which is the field of view. If I have a very narrow field of view, then that means that I'm generally usually like zoomed in. So for instance, don't these degrees don't matter so much, but right here, if I have about a 12-degree field of view, I'm probably looking through a zoom lens of about 135 millimeter. But if I have a 35 millimeter field of view, that's a wider field of view. I'm seeing more from the left to the right. So that is opening up my field of view. So it's more of a normal lens. And then when I have a wide angle, something like say a 16 or 24 millimeter, then I'm even increasing the field of view more. Right? So I have a wide angle lens. Now in that previous chart, I've listed things of when it's a zoom lens or when it's a wide angle lens or when it's a normal lens. I've kind of put them in categories so you can kind of figure out what those are. Yeah, so we also have something all the way out here, which a field of view would be 180 degrees, right? And that would be considered a really super wide. Generally, they call this a fisheye field of view, right? Because the fish eyes are on the side of their head. Ours aren't; they're in the middle. So a fish has Hopefully
Mm.
they're
this
in the
super
middle.
wide field of view, 180 degrees field of view, so they can see when predators are coming after them and wanting to eat them. We don't have to worry about that quite as much, at least not in this country. All right. All right, guys. So now you understand the field of view is the area that I see based on the focal length of my lens. Now, what are these millimeters though? What does this millimeter mean here, right? 135, 35, 50. What do those mean? And what is this actual measurement, all right? I'm going to talk about that here. So let me turn this off here, and I'm going to turn this on here.
Okay, so let me stop that really quick. So what we talked about then, are you pretty clear then about what the focal length is and the field of view, those two subjects? Anybody have any comments or questions about that you're not clear about? Okay, good. So now I'm going to explain a little bit of what this millimeter is actually a measurement of, okay? Because this is a little confusing when people talk about, a 50 millimeter lens versus a 150 millimeter lens and so forth.
Here. Okay. Let me just open this up. I want to do this here. All right. So this is the confusing part to a lot of people because most people think that size, like if I have a lens that's 105 millimeters. Excuse my drawing here, it really sucks because I don't have a pen. But if I have a 105 millimeter lens, it's not the length here. It's not the length of the lens. All right. What it is.
That's going to be on the test, guys. And a lot of people, usually half the people, get this question wrong. So I've just given you the answer right there. The 105 or 50 millimeter or whatever the marking is on the lens, right? That's the focal length, is not the measurement of the lens. Okay. It's not the length of the lens, has nothing to do with that. Okay. So that's going to be a question. Just gave you the answer.
is it's actually the distance from the optical center of the lens to the image plane or the sensor. This is based on what I've done some research on. I used to think that it was a measurement within the lens itself, but what they're saying that it's actually a measurement from the optical center of the lens to the image plane. Now the problem is that we have, and I'll talk about this in a second, is that we have this other measurement here, which is called flange to focal distance. So that's why this doesn't make sense to me so much, but this is what I'm going off of. And I'll go over this in a second. But the flange to focal distance is the area from the where the lens mounts to the camera to the image sensor. So it's that distance right there. And this will change from camera to camera based on the size of the camera, the size of the sensor, whether it's a DSLR or whether it's a mirrorless camera. All right. So let's get back to this millimeters then. All right. So basically, it's not really the length of the lens as so much it is the length from where the center of the lens is to the actual sensor. All right. So if I have a 105 millimeter lens, they're talking about this particular distance right here. And that 105 millimeters will get me a certain field of view. If I put a 50 millimeter lens on, it's going to give me a certain field of view as well, but my field of view starts to become wider. So the smaller the number, the wider field of view. So 50 millimeter is pretty wide, but 35 is even wider and 25 is even wider. So the smaller the number, the more I can see in my frame from left to right, right? The more I can see. The larger the number, the less I can see, but I can also see further. It's like using binoculars, so I can see further away. All right, so let me just step back here for a second. Let's turn this off and turn this on. So I've got a couple examples here of some different lens lengths. So remember sorry, turn this back on here. Remember that distance that we're talking about is from the center of the lens, or where the lenses converge in the center. And I'm not sure if I can get too technical on this because I don't know it myself. It's hard to find out this information. But basically, where those lenses converge to this area here, that's going to be 24 millimeters on this one. Obviously, a 50 millimeter is going to have the lens farther away, and so this is going to be 50 millimeters in length to the sensor. And then if I had a 105 millimeter, well, that center is going to be about right there, and this is going to, or 150 millimeter, sorry, 150 millimeter in length right here. So it's not the length of the lens. Now keep that in mind because I have that on the test and everybody seems to get that wrong. So it's not the measurement of the lens. The 150 millimeters is related to how long the lens is because obviously if I have a 150 millimeter lens, it's got to be bigger than a 50 millimeter lens. Now, there are not, let me see if I can rephrase this. Sorry. If I have a lens from, say, Sony and I have a lens from Canon, and let's say that they're both 150 millimeter lenses, one can actually be slightly bigger physically in its overall size than the other, just because of the way it's designed inside, right? But the actual the focal length here is not going to be different. It's just the housing, the outside part of the lens may actually be bigger on one model versus another. Um, I've seen it. I've seen lenses that can vary as much as 2 or 3 inches in length, but actually be the same focal length. Like I one time I was looking at an 85 millimeter Sony lens, and then I was comparing it to an aftermarket lens, like a Sigma brand lens. And that 85 millimeter lens was about 3 inches longer. And so I was like, why is this lens so much longer? The focal length on the inside is the same, but the physical size of the lens was bigger on the one model just because of the design of the lens, right? So remember that the lens itself uh, will be related to the focal length, but it is not the measurement, right? The focal length is the center here to where the sensor is. All right, cool. So now we kind of understand that a little bit. And to be honest, this kind of technical stuff probably not that important that you know it, but I would like you to understand it because a lot of people will misquote things, right? They'll say, "Oh yeah, the 105 millimeter or 50 millimeter lens, that's how tall the lens is." And that's not true. So you don't want to be out there giving misinformation to people, especially if you told them that you took my class. so yeah, so that's why I like you to know some of this technical stuff because it can help you in the future when you're trying to buy a lens or maybe you're trying to explain something to another person about what this means. Okay, so um, so let's turn that off here, and now we know a little bit about what the focal length is, right, and what our field of view, and those are directly related. So, what about the difference between lenses? You might hear some people talk about lenses where, sorry, let me go. You might you might hear some people talk about a lens and they'll say, "I have a prime lens," and you'll be like, "Oh, well, good for you. What's that mean?" It's okay. Prime lenses generally mean that they do not zoom in and out. That means that they have a fixed focal length, basically meaning that my field of view is also fixed. I cannot zoom in and I cannot zoom out. So you'll notice that this Canon over here on the left has a 50 millimeter. It does not say 50 to 200 or 50 to 100. It just says 50. So that means that that's a prime lens, meaning that I only have one field of view. Where this lens on the other side here, you can see it says 18 to 55. That means it'll go from an 18, a wide angle, and I'll be able to zoom in to a 55 millimeter field of view. So I've got a range, all right? So if you have any camera that has a little dash there, or any lens that has a dash, that means that you'll have a range to be able to change your field of view. But a prime lens does not. A prime lens is a fixed focal length. So a lot of people will ask me, well, why would I want to buy a prime lens if it's only going to give me one field of view? What's the advantage of a prime lens? Well, let me tell you a couple of advantages of a prime lens. One is that usually because it doesn't have to have all the extra elements inside the lens to zoom in and zoom out, it will be less expensive, or for the same price, you get a better quality lens. So let's say that this lens over here costs $500, okay, this one, and if this costs $500, if you bought a $500 prime lens, most likely it's going to be of higher quality optics and higher quality materials. Okay? Not always, but in general, that's how it works. Okay, so a lot of people will prefer to buy prime lenses because They get a better lens for the same price, okay, or more quality for a less price. When you're shooting with the prime lens, you can still zoom in and zoom out, but that is going to be up to you. All you need to do as a photographer is move closer to the subject, walk closer to the subject. Now you're zooming in, walk back, and now you're zooming out. So a prime lens is a really good lens to have to actually practice your photography with, because you can get really good at shooting with a prime lens. A lot of professional portrait photographers, if you're doing model photography or headshot photography, they like using these prime lenses because they're generally not zooming in and zooming out. They basically have their scene set up and they're only shooting maybe 5 to 10 feet away at all times, and so they don't need a lens that's going to zoom in and zoom out. So they really want something that's simple and of high quality for the most money, and that way they'll use a prime lens for doing that style of photography. Now, if you're at an event where you're going to be shooting people at distances, and you're going to be moving around a lot and there's a stage, well, prime lens probably isn't going to be your best bet. You're going to want to have something that you can stay in one spot and zoom in and get closer and zoom away, right?
So, does that clear up your any ideas you had about what a prime lens is and why you may want to get one? Because I think prime lenses are actually something that everybody should have in their bag. You know, everybody should have something like a 50 millimeter or 35 millimeter prime. Another advantage of these prime lenses is that not only are you getting a little higher quality housing and better quality glass and optics for the same amount of money, you're also usually getting a lens that can open up to a really wide aperture. And that's a huge advantage when you're doing portrait photography and you want that nice blurry background or that bokeh background that we talked about previously. So usually these prime lenses are going to open up to a large aperture like 1.8, or even larger like 1.6 or 1.2. And this is going to give you a very shallow depth of field. So you're going to get a nice compressed background, lots of blurring to separate your subject from the background. There's lots of good YouTube videos about prime lenses and doing portrait photography because they're really popular in portrait photography. So I see a lot of, they call it the nifty 50, right? The 50 millimeter is real popular, but I'm seeing 85 millimeter gain in popularity because that tends to compress the image a little bit more because it's almost like you're zooming in slightly with that 85. So you have to step back just a tiny bit, but you tend to get more blurriness or more bokeh in the background with the 85 millimeter prime with a large aperture, like say 1.8 or 1.6. So those are really good lenses too. And these lenses can range in price for as little as, $150 to $200, all the way up to thousands of dollars, depending on the quality of the optical glass that you get inside of them. And those optics are going to determine how sharp your photo is and how clear your photos is, compared to some lenses that are, say, the one that came with your camera, like a kit lens or a lower price lens. So you're paying for that clarity and that quality in the glass, the amount of effort that goes into manufacturing that glass inside the lens.
Brady,
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, and this is going back to the like the 105 millimeter lens,
Okay.
just like in the video. Now, since it is not the length of the lens itself, it is from the middle of the lens to the sensor. Now, the body of the camera, since they are of different widths, like the mirrorless could be so much thinner as opposed to the DSLR, which is much bigger, or so I'm
It's a little off, huh?
yeah.
Yeah, that confused me
Like,
too in the beginning
yeah.
because that was something I talked about in the video, and I've tried to find some data on that, and I can't seem to find anything that will correct that. So they talk about the optical center of a lens, which is basically where the lens converges in the middle and creates everything very clear when you focus. Okay, so that measurement is different on all lenses. On this lens, it could be a little higher up or a little lower down. But then they talk about that 105 millimeter is from the optical center to the lens to the focal plane of the camera. So that's the part that gets a little confusing, because I'm not sure if it's where it mounts on the flange or if it's actually the focal plane, which is where the sensor captures the image. So I'll look a little bit more into that and see if I can find some more, clearness on that. But I think the main takeaway here is that when we're talking about lenses and we're talking about that millimeters, we're not talking about the actual housing that the
Right.
lens is housed in, right? And that's where a lot of people get confused. So I want to make sure that you're clear on that, that it's not if I put the lens on the table and took a ruler and measured it in millimeters, that's not going to be what that millimeter comes from. So it's the optical center of the lens to the focal plane of the camera. And, like I said, that could be different on a DSLR or a mirrorless. I think what it is because let's say if I'm buying a 105 millimeter Canon lens for a full frame Canon mount, they've already determined where the focal plane is on that camera. It's not like I'm taking that Canon lens and mounting it on a Nikon Micro Four Thirds, right? It's specifically made for an E mount, Canon mount, or an A mount, or what AF mount, or whatever they use in their mounts. So they know that 105 millimeter is made for this kind of a mount, and it's going to be used on either a DSLR or it's going to be used on a mirrorless. So they already know where the focal plane is on that particular camera body. So I think that's where that measurement comes into, and that's the part that's a little confusing.
Yeah, I understand. So that means when we talk about this, this is only for that particular camera because that's what they are designed for. Now, if you
Exactly.
go to, because I'm not sure whether these lenses are interchangeable between cameras, but I've heard of these adapters and all that you use, but then you are changing a lot of things there.
Well, that's a good point, because remember we talked about we can actually take and like a Canon lens like this. If let's say I have a Canon lens and it's a good lens, but I have a Sony body, okay? How do I get this Canon lens to work on my Sony body if that messes up the optical center of the lens to the focal plane? Well, that's where the adapter comes in. So let's say if I'm going to mount this directly to my Sony camera, I could be throwing off the focal plane by 20 millimeters. So if I use the adapter for this lens, most likely on my Sony, it's going to be a 20 millimeter width adapter, right? So that creates that optical center even again. So the Canon lens thinks it's being mounted on a Canon camera because the distance is the same now. So yeah, those little adapters that we buy so we can interchange lenses, they're going to be the correct height that they need to be, and also the correct kind of mount so we can mount and interchange, together. So that's exactly the thing there.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so we know a little bit about prime lenses and we know a little bit about zoom lenses. So what are all the different markings on these lenses, and what the heck do these things mean? So let me try to explain some of these things here. All right, so on this lens here, we have the type of mount that the lens has, and every manufacturer has their own mount. Sony has their own mount. They have several different mounts. I'm talking about where it mounts to the camera body. Panasonic, Nikon, they all have their own mounts, and so does so does Canon, sorry. So does your camera. So does Canon. So Canon has different mounts. They have an EF mount, an EFS mount, and a couple of others as well. So the first designation is usually the type of mount, right? That's whether or not it's going to fit your camera body. So you need to make sure that you're buying a lens that'll fit your camera body. The second number here is going to be whether or not it's a prime lens or a zoom lens, okay? So based on what I've told you, is this a prime lens or is this a zoom lens? Huh? Oh, I can't hear you. Of course I can't hear you. If you said zoom, you're correct, because it goes from a 24 millimeter field of view to a 70 millimeter. So this is a zoom lens. So what about this third number over here? What does this mean? Well, what this means is the maximum aperture, meaning the largest opening that you can have in your lens. Remember, the aperture is the area in the lens that opens and closes to let in more or less light. It also controls our depth of field, what we see in focus in front of and behind our subject. So in this particular case here, we see this number, which is a 1, followed by a colon and then 2.8. Well, the 2.8 is telling me, because I only have one number, it's telling me that if I'm at 24 millimeter, I can open this up all the way to 2.8. That's a pretty big opening. And even if I zoom into 70 millimeter, I can still use a 2.8, right? Now, it will do all the other apertures, right? But usually this number here is telling you the largest aperture that it can use, right? That's the largest. So
I want to stop it there because this is also going to be on the quiz. I want you to know that this is called a lens that can maintain a constant aperture all the way through the zoom. Now, these are a little rare. It's not the norm, but you will pay a little bit more money for a lens that can open up to 2.8 when it's at 24 millimeter, but still open up to 2.8 when it's at 70 millimeter. So this is a lens that can maintain constant aperture through the zoom range. Now, normally you're going to have two numbers there, and I'm going to explain that in a second in the video here. So that's going to be on the quiz, and I'm going to ask you, are there some zoom lenses that can maintain a constant aperture through the zoom range? And the answer is yes, there are, but they are usually a little more expensive because of what they have to do to design them so that they can work like that.
What does the 1 mean here?
It's just like the ratio, like one to one. Like, so it's giving you the reference of, a starting point, right? So starting at 1, that's our starting point. And then if we have a zoom where the aperture will change, then it'll have the 2 numbers after it. In this particular case, we only have 1 number because it can maintain constant aperture throughout the whole
So maybe
range.
that's what it means, that 1 means constant.
No, because it's going to have a 1 on the one that'll have the 2 numbers as well too. So I think it's I'm not exactly sure, but I think it's basically meaning that that's the base, like it's a starting point, and then if if you uh, if you go to a lens that zooms, then it'll start with 1. That's the ratio, and then it'll have an aperture of either 2.8 to 3.5 or 2.8 to 3.9 or something like that. All right. So I don't know if this number is critical because, to be honest, I've never seen a lens that has anything other than the 1 before the little semicolon there, right? So that's always usually a 1, and then the number that follows after is the important number.
Okay, thanks.
be able to use 3.5 and 5.6 and f8 and f11 and f16 and f22. All those are available in this lens, but this number always represents the largest aperture for the shallowest depth of field that you'll be able to use on any of these other things. So if you look at this lens over here, you'll notice that it has a couple of different markings. Okay, why does it have 2 numbers here, and why is this so confusing? Well, most camera lenses cannot maintain a consistent aperture all the way through the zoom length. Sorry. So what happens is, generally when you zoom in, your aperture has to decrease. So the hole in your lens has to get smaller. Otherwise, they have to do certain things within the internal parts of the lens to make it so that your aperture can stay constant. This generally costs money. So lenses that can maintain a constant aperture all the way through the focal range are going to be more expensive. So you're not going to see those as frequently as you will something like this. So what does this mean? Well, what this means is that the first number is in relationship to the first field of view or focal length. So at 15, which is my widest angle, I can use a aperture of 3.5, right? So I can use a 3.5 as the largest aperture I can use if I'm using a 15 millimeter field of view on this lens. But if I zoom in, right, if as I start to zoom in, if I go all the way to 85 millimeter and I zoom in, I can no longer use that 3.5 aperture. I can only use the 5.6. Okay? So this has this range, 3.5 to 5.6, which is in direct relationship to this here. Right? So they're related. So the first one, right, 15, I can go to 3.5, and the second one, 85, I can go to 5.6 is the largest aperture that I can use. And that's generally the case in most lenses. That other lens over there that I showed you is a little bit unique.
Now, I just want to mention too, because I didn't mention it here, is that remember that those numbers are signifying the largest aperture that you can use. It doesn't mean that you can't go to a smaller aperture. So all the other apertures are available to us when we're at those zoom links. So for instance, if I was at 15 millimeter, I could do 3.5 would be the largest I can go to, but I can also do f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, f22. So I can still use all those other apertures, but that number represents the largest. Why? Because a lot of photographers want to know if they can get that nice blurry background, that compressed background, so they're getting that shallow depth of field. They want to know what the largest aperture they can go to so they can determine their depth of field, whether it's shallow or not. So same thing if I'm zoomed in here at 85 millimeter on this lens, I can use a 5.6 would be the largest opening, but I could still use an f8, an f11, an f16, f22, all the ones above that. I just can't go any bigger. Now, what if you were in between? What if you were, since this goes from 15 to 85 millimeter, what if I was using like a 50 millimeter, like I was zoomed in like halfway? Well, in that case, they don't show you what the largest is, but you just got to consider that it's going to probably be somewhere in between these two numbers, right? So if I was at 50 millimeter on this lens, my best guess is the largest aperture I can go to would probably be like an f4, right? So this is your range, and then you've got all the other ones that you can go in between. It's a little confusing. I know this thing is doesn't make sense sometimes because the numbers are backwards, right? But once we learn, we relate the aperture with the size of the hole, right? The size of the hole is smaller as the aperture increases, and as the aperture gets bigger, then the number goes down. So we learned that in the first week, so we kind of understand what that is, right?
Brady, I have a
Yeah,
question
go ahead.
about. I have got one lens that I found in my collection. It's a
Uh-huh.
18 to 55 zoom lens.
15 to 55.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
18 to
Okay.
50. But the thing is that it does not show anything about the ratio that you're talking.
Doesn't
It's
have those numbers on it, huh?
no, it says macro 0.25 meter slash zero point 0.8 feet. And the largest opening it has on the zoom is 3.5.
Interesting. Okay.
It's a macro lens, but I mean, the closest I could go was like 2 feet away.
So
But it
it
does not,
says macro on the outside of the ring
yeah,
there.
yeah, where you're showing one
Uh-huh.
ratio
Right.
2.8, it doesn't
So
show
if
that. It
a
shows,
lot of macro lenses will have a little switch on the side, right, where you can switch to macro and normal. Does it have like a little switch on the side of the lens anywhere?
no, it has switches only for autofocus or stabilizer. But the reading on it says it's a zoom lens, but why does it say macro? I don't understand.
Well, usually the macro just determines the minimum focusing distance, right? We talked about that previously. So the minimum focusing distance is how close I can get to a subject before it won't focus anymore, right? In most macro lenses, you should, I mean, the idea of a macro is that you're able to get really close and get to like a 1-to-1 within the frame of your shot. So most macro lenses, you should be able to get within, you know, 8 to 10 inches and sometimes closer without not knocking it out of focus. So still being able to focus even though you're really close to your subject, right? But what you can do is maybe you could just take a quick photo of the outside of the lens like this here, and then email it to me, and I'll look it up and see if I can find some information about that lens. Okay,
Oh, all right, thank you.
and then we'll see exactly what it can do.
I'll do that.
Okay, cool.
It maintains a constant aperture, or I can maintain a constant aperture if I wanted to. This is probably a more expensive lens. All right, so a couple other little things on here. This right here, you might see a number 2. You might see a number 3 or 4 or 5. And what that generally means is that this is the second edition of this lens, meaning that they made a lens previously and now they've upgraded that lens. It has a lot of the same features, but maybe they've upgraded certain things. And you'll have to look at the manufacturer's specifications to see exactly what they upgraded. But if you see a 2 or a 3 or a 4, then you know that it's the third or the fourth generation of that lens. So they've made improvements on it. That could be a good thing because usually if a lens comes out and it's been around for a long time, that means it's popular, and they've made changes based on request of photographers to increase the quality of that lens. So that's not a bad thing to have a 2 or 3 on your lens. This right here, USM, that stands for ultra silent motor. Now, I'm not going to go to detail on this, but when you have a zoom lens, right? When you have a zoom lens, the lens has to zoom in and out using your autofocus, right, or your auto zoom. So there's a motor in there that controls that zooming, right? Especially when you're shooting video. Right? When you're shooting video, a lot of times the video will zoom in automatically depending on your camera setting, or it will zoom out based on when you're doing it. Now, there are certain types of motors that are faster when it comes to focusing your camera, right? When you're in autofocus mode, these USMs are really quiet, the ultra silent motors, but they're not that fast to focus. I mean, they're pretty fast, but they're not as fast as some of the other types of motors that are out there. And to be
I just want to be clear on this. It actually stands for ultrasonic motor, but a lot of photographers refer to the USM as a silent one because they're slower and they don't make as much noise when they zoom in and zoom out. Okay. So that's the difference there.
honest with you, there's so many of them, I couldn't even begin to go into detail on this. But I just want you to know what this means. Is basically it's the focusing motor when you're zooming in and out, and how quickly it can focus. People who are into sports photography don't really care so much if when you're focusing, if it's loud. But people who are doing like indoor photography, like say a ballet or something like that, they wouldn't want that motor to be really loud, because when you're shooting video, you might actually hear that motor zooming in and focusing, while you're recording. That your sound could pick it up. So if you're into video recording and doing that kind of stuff, you'd want to be concerned with this. But in most cases, for you doing standard photography, it's not a big concern.
Yeah, and something like that, guys, if you're looking at buying a lens and you are concerned with the loudness of the lens when it zooms in and zooms out or focuses, just make sure that you ask the person you're buying it from, or kind of do some research on that to find out if that's something that could create an issue for you, because maybe you need to have something that's really quiet, or maybe you need something that's really fast. There's not a huge difference though, so I wouldn't get too concerned with it. I've played around with some of the ones that were claimed to be noisy and ones that weren't, and audibly I could barely tell the difference. So, but a lot of people are really sensitive to that. And if you're recording video, just remember, when you're recording video, sometimes your camera's microphone can actually pick up when the lens is zooming in or focusing. You'll hear a little zoot, 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 zoot kind of a thing. You might have even watched videos like that where you can actually hear the lens, when it's doing its zooming or focusing. So that's just what those numbers mean, the little USM, and there might be a different marking on there. To be honest, I don't know all the different types of motors that are out there. And usually that's something that you have to kind of ask about. It's in the technical specifications on the website or something. It's not going to be on the box. They're not going to promote it or things like that.
All right. So one last thing on here actually two last things. Sorry. You might see something on here, this that says IS, and that could stand for image stabilization. Remember that most image stabilization is built into the lens, but some lenses do not have it. So this is important if you have a camera that doesn't have it inside the body, right? A lot of cameras do not have image stabilization in the body. So if you're buying a lens and you want to make sure that the lens has built-in image stabilization to eliminate camera shake, you want to make sure that that lens has it, right? If you don't have it in your body. Does that make sense? I'm getting off track. Sorry, guys. Let me put this simple. Most lenses have image stabilization. Most camera bodies do not. So generally, you do want to get a lens that has image stabilization. The reason why you wouldn't care for the image stabilization is it does cost more money. So to give you an example, that let's say I had a lens that was a prime lens. It's 50 millimeter, and it has it's a fixed focal length, and it sells for say $200, right? But it doesn't have image stabilization. Now, if I bought that same lens, they might have the same model that comes with image stabilization, but now that lens will be $300. So you're going to pay $100 more to get the same lens with the image stabilization. Now, if you need it, you need it, so you got to have it. But some photographers aren't concerned with image stabilization because they're shooting on a tripod most of the time, and they don't care. If they're indoors and doing product photography, or they're doing model photo shoots and they're on a tripod using a remote trigger or a remote control, you don't really need the image stabilization, so why spend the extra money for it? Also, if your camera, like my camera, has image stabilization built into the body of the camera. So I've got it even if I have a lens that doesn't have it, right? So I can buy a lens that doesn't have image stabilization and save a little bit of money because my camera body has it. So you need to know whether or not your camera body has it. And like I said, in most cases, if you have purchased a camera that is usually below about $900 or $1,000, most likely it doesn't have in-body stabilization. Okay, those are usually reserved for more expensive cameras. Although prices are coming down with cameras these days, and they're starting to add the image stabilization in the body more and more now. I'll try to talk about that later and talk to you about the different types of image stabilization. How many times did I say image stabilization in this video? Were you counting them? Like 50? All right.
Too much. I'm going to say it again, though. So I just want you to be clear on this, because I know when you're out looking to purchase a lens for your camera, this can be a big concern. I had a student actually at the beginning of this year that bought a lens and wasn't clear on this, and she bought one that didn't have image stabilization because she was looking more at the price. She's like, "Oh, this is a really good price for this lens," and she bought it, not realizing that there were two models on that lens. One model sold for $400 because it did have image stabilization, and the other one sold for like $279 because it didn't have it. So she thought, well, I just found a great deal on this lens. It's $279. So she bought the lens and realized that when she put it on her camera, all of her images started becoming very blurry, and she couldn't figure out why. The reason why is her camera body did not have image stabilization, and now her lens did not have image stabilization. So when she was taking handheld photos, a lot of stuff came out blurry if she wasn't using a fast shutter speed. Now, you might think, well, why don't they just put image stabilization on all the lenses and that would just save this problem? Well, not everybody needs it, right? Let's say you're a product photographer and you're doing like those product photo shoots that we did a couple weeks ago. In that case, you're probably shooting in a very controlled environment. Your camera is nice and steady on a tripod. You're using a remote trigger or your self timer on your camera. Why pay the extra $150 to get the lens stabilized when you're not even going to be touching your camera, right? You're doing a product photo shoot. Or the other option would be that you have one of the more expensive cameras that actually has what's called IBS. And IBS stands for in-body stabilization. Okay, so all the camera manufacturers like Sony, Nikon, Panasonic, they all have cameras that have this in-body stabilization, and that allows you to buy lenses that don't have it, or use a really old lens that doesn't have it, and you're still going to get the benefit of having it in your camera body. So this is why be careful when you buy a lens, because sometimes there'll be two models and you'll see two different prices. So look for that little IS on the front of the camera, which stands for image stabilization. It could be an SS, like Sony has a thing called steady shot. So it's SS. And I'm trying to think what there's another one. It's like OSS, which stands for optical steady shot. So each manufacturer has their own kind of term for what their image stabilization is, but just be aware that when you buy a lens, make sure that you know that this one does come with it or it doesn't come with it based on your needs. Okay.
I'm not going to say it anymore. All right. So last thing on this one is this, and you guys learned a little bit about what this is. Okay. So this 82 millimeters and this 72 millimeters, that is the thread size on the outside of the lens. Remember the filter lesson that we had about the UV filters and the polarizing filters? That tells you what size filter to buy. So if you're going to buy a polarizing filter or a UV filter or a neutral density filter, look on the outside of your lens and you'll see the size right there. And that's the size you buy. Okay. So pretty simple. All right. Whew. So
That's also too, remember we talked about the macro, the little adapter where you can flip your lens around, flip your lens around to turn it into a macro lens. That's the reverse mount ring. So that's the size that you would buy if you were going to buy a reverse mount ring. If it says 72 millimeter on the outside of your lens, then that's the size thread that you're going to buy, 72 millimeter.
last thing I want to talk about here is I want to talk about that flange to focal distance that I mentioned previously in the first part of this video. And I also want to talk about adapters and why the adapters are out there. So the flange to focal distance over here on the left, I have a Sony camera. Now this isn't related to the this is not related to the millimeters in the lens. All right, this is something completely different. All right, so forget about that other stuff now, because I'm going to talk to you about flange to focal distance. Right, so the sensor plane is where the sensor is. So remember, my sensor is located right about here, where this film or sensor plane is here. Okay, but the flange of my camera is where the lens mounts to. That's the outside of my camera body. Okay, that's where the lens mounts to. So this distance here, right, from here where it mounts, sorry, from here to here, okay, that's the flange to focal distance, the FFD, flange to focal distance. You can see that over here on a DSLR, look at the difference. Because we have to have a mirror inside of our DSLR, it has to be a lot larger. So where it mounts on the flange to the sensor is so much wider, right? Look at the difference here. Here, very short flange to focal distance. Here, very wide or long flange to focal distance. Now, this actually can affect your photography a little bit. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but the reason why I'm showing you this is because they make adapters so that if you want to use another manufacturer's brand lens on a different brand camera, you can do it. Okay. The adapters out there are something like this. They're going to look like this right here. This one's built by a company called Metabones, but there are lots of other companies that make these adapters. Now, these can be relatively inexpensive, or they can be very expensive depending on the kind of adapter it is and what you're going to be able to achieve with it. Just as a quick thing here, I did a search on, let's see, where is that adapter? Let me just do this. I guess I closed it. Sony to Canon adapter. Go to Amazon. Here we go. All right, so let's say I have a Sony camera and I'm trying to get a particular lens with a particular field of view that zooms in and out that I want, but let's say Sony doesn't really make one, or I can't find an aftermarket one like Tamron or Sigma. All right. So, but there's a Canon lens. Maybe I already own a Canon camera. Maybe I already have some Canon lenses. And I'm like, boy, it would be really great if I can use my really nice Canon lens on my Sony body camera. Can I do that? Yes, you can. So in this case here, there's this adapter here, which is the Metabones mount that goes from Canon, Canon to Sony. So I can use my Canon lens on my Sony camera if I mount this adapter. Now, you might be a little scared of this price. Look at that. $422 just for this adapter. Now, there may be less expensive adapters out there that you can use, but think about it. Sometimes if you've already got a really nice lens, sometimes going out and buying a new lens for your Sony camera, that could cost you $700. Where in this case, if you've already got a good Canon lens that you want to use on your Sony camera, this can be, 60% of the price by getting the adapter. And then you'll be able to use other Canon lenses on there as well. Right, so this is an option. I just want you to know this is available because a lot of people feel like they're stuck if they've got one brand camera and then they can't use other lenses on it, but that's not the case. So if I come back over here, you can see that one of the things that we want to achieve by using these adapters is to have the same flange to focal distance. So here you can see that with the adapter installed, the 26mm adapter here, that this distance here is now the same as this distance here, right? So by putting on this adapter, we were able to mimic the flange to focal distance on that Canon, and we have now the mount for the Canon lens, so when we put that on, it will function properly, and it will work. The zoom will work, the autofocus will work, everything will work properly, right? So just keep that in mind that there are those adapters that are out there. All right, guys, so I'm not going to go over. I think that was it. Yeah. Okay, cool. So lots of stuff we covered there. I know lots of little technical things and everything. I'm gonna have a little quiz this week. I'm gonna send you. That's gonna have a lot of that stuff we went over, and most of the stuff I've given you the answers for. So hopefully you'll do really well on it. Right? Hopefully you were taking notes. All right, let's close this out. All right, guys. So I want to show you a couple of things that we can do to our photos by moving them into Photoshop. I know some of you may have taken my Photoshop class before. Maybe you have some Photoshop skills. Maybe you don't. But I'm going to show you some basic stuff that pretty much anybody can do when it comes to editing the photo and editing it in Photoshop. So I want you to go ahead and launch your Lightroom catalog. So go ahead and do that. I'm going to close this because I was having a problem with it earlier and I just want to relaunch it. So I want to quit, skip. All right, so I'm going to double click this and reopen my Lightroom catalog. Does anybody have any last questions or comments on some of the things we just covered on the lenses? You guys good on that? Just make sure if you're going to buy a lens to do your research on it, make sure it's the right lens that you want for the kind of photography that you're going to do. There's lots of really good comparisons on YouTube if you're looking to buy lenses. There's guys that'll go in and do these analysts on these lenses and actually take photos with different color charts and with targets on the wall. They show the sharpness and the clarity of them and all that. It's really intense what they can do. Okay, so I'm going to start in my library. So I'm going to my library and I'm going to go over to my folders. I want to open up the extra lesson folder because we have a bunch of subfolders in there, remember? So I'm going to go to the extra lessons folder and open up
And I'm going to scroll down to, let's see, it is the one that's called Old Color Photos. Okay, so I want to open up the Old Color Photos. There's three, there should be 3 pictures in there. I'm gonna make my thumbnail a little bigger here. I was just seeing if we had any visitors so far. Looks like there's one person in here. It just says open house. Don't know who that is. If anybody is in here from the open house and just kind of browsing around, if you have questions, don't be afraid to ask if you want to have any questions answered about the course and the class. Just know that if you are here, we're kind of getting towards the end of the class. So a lot of the stuff that might seem a little confusing if you just come into it right now. But this is our 8th week, right? And each course is 9 weeks long. So we're already into the 8th week of this digital photography class. So most of the students you've learned so much by now, right? You've already done, 5 photo shoots. You've already covered lots of stuff in Adobe Lightroom, lots of editing. And we're coming to the last part of the class, which is we're going to do our final photo shoot this week, guys, and I'm going to assign for you. And then we're going to have one more quiz, one more test. And then next week, we're only here Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So it's a short week. And Wednesday, we're working asynchronous. So we're not working together on Wednesday. I'm going to send you an assignment. So yeah, the last day of class is Thursday of next week. And then the class starts back over again, brand new class in the 4th quarter, which would be on Monday, the 29th. Okay, so if you're going to sign back up again, by all means, feel free to sign back up. All right, so I want to talk about this photo here. Okay, I'm going to double click it to open it up into loop view here. And I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, and I want to show you what this thing looks like here. So you'll notice that it has all these little pattern on the top of this image. And if I zoom in even more, you can totally see what's going on here. What the heck is that? Why is that there? Is that caused by the scan that took this picture and scanned it, the scanner? Sometimes the scanner will create a repeating image. It'll cause some repeating images or dust or scratches on there. But those little things were actually due to the photograph being placed in a photo album. And if you remember, some of the photo albums had this sticky paper. If you're old enough to remember photo albums, I know some of the students are young, they probably never even had a photo album. It's all digital, right? It's all, my photo album's right here, it's in my phone. It's like, well, the old photo albums had that clear plastic paper. You'd put your picture down on, it would stick to like the back, and then you put the clear plastic paper over it. Well, a lot of the backings of those photo albums either would have lines or they'd have these little C cups or little circles, and that's where the glue was on the back of the photo. If the photo was in the album long enough, then what would happen sometimes is we'd get the impression of the glue on the backing paper that would show through. I see this all the time in lots of people who, well, when I used to do editing for restoring old photos, I would see either the lines in them or I'd see something that would mimic this sort of pattern, right? And it was because the photo had been in an album for 20 years and it had faded, the photo had faded and matched the backing of the backing paper that it was stuck onto. So that becomes an issue. So if I go back to, let me go back to fit to screen here, sorry. So how can I eliminate that and get rid of that then in Lightroom? Is there a way to do this? What would you think that you could do to try to eliminate those little marks that are in the photograph? Because can anybody tell me in what module do they think might actually increase the quality of that and get rid of those marks? Any suggestions?
Detail.
Yeah, detail panel. And the detail panel is what? What's in the detail panel?
Noise reduction.
Noise reduction, correct. So if we look at those little patterns, we can kind of think of that kind of like being noise, right? It looks kind of like noise. Now, noise, as we know, luminance noise and color noise, usually those are little specks that are throughout our whole photograph, right? And it's caused by the camera not being able to see the image correctly, and it boosts the signal and it creates that noise. Now, these are a lot bigger than noise. But let's try it. Let's give it a shot and see if we can make it work. So I'm going to bring this over to my develop module. I'm going to click on the develop module. All right. And I'm going to go straight down. I'm going to scroll over here on the right-hand side. I want to go down to the detail panel, right? The detail panel is where the noise reduction is. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down, and I'm thinking there's no color noise in here, right? Because this is not a color photograph, but I'm gonna try both. So I'm gonna bump the luminance up, and let's see what happens here. So I'm sliding it up, and I can see it's kind of cleaning it up a little bit, but it's not getting rid of those things. I'm gonna go all the way. Let's see what happens. I go 100. I'm still not getting rid of it. Let's see if I turn on and off the little switch, right, from the detail panel, before and after. Yeah, I can see that it's actually getting rid of the noise in between those little marks, but it's not really reducing the marks, so it's not working. So that's not good. Well, let me go back down here, and I'm going to try. I've got this all the way. I got the luminance all the way to 100. Let's try adding color noise reduction, and just maybe that might help a little bit too. All right, so I'm going to try to add some here, and it's not. I'm going to go all the way. So I've got my noise reduction at 100 on the luminance and 100 on the color, and I'm not getting rid of that noise, right? So yeah, it's just cleaning up in between those little areas, but it's not doing anything. Okay, now what? So what do I do now? Just forget about it, right? Can't fix it. Well, if you didn't know the little trick that I'm about to show you, yeah, pretty much this would be a loss, right? We wouldn't be able to fix this here in the detail panel in Lightroom, at least not yet. But, you know, they are going to be doing some upgrades to the 2022 Lightroom, which is coming up really soon. And I hear they're going to add some additional features in this noise reduction panel that will probably help us get rid of something like this. But as it stands right now, I don't have very many options to be able to get rid of that. I mean, I could probably go into the basic panel here and maybe try to reduce the highlights a little and the whites to see if I can get rid of that. No, that's not doing it. And wow, the black's just making it worse. Okay, so nothing's working. All right, so what can we do? So here's what I want to do. I'm going to show you a little trick. Let's reset the photo. If you've been playing around with it, I want to hit the reset button in the lower right corner. Let's reset that so we're back to square one, right? We're back to 0 here. Where is my... Oh, hold on, sorry, I'm lost here. I can't find my zoom window. Okay. Now, I might have shown you this before, like a quick preview, but you can actually open a photograph in Photoshop directly from Lightroom. So they sort of integrate together. And in fact, if I open a photograph in Photoshop and do some editing on it, providing I do the right steps, when I save that photograph, it will actually save back a copy into Lightroom. So I'll have my original, and then I'll also get a copy that I edited in Photoshop. So it's pretty cool. So here's what we do to get it in there. Now, hopefully all of you have Photoshop. If you don't have Photoshop, then this isn't going to work. But most of you are subscribing to the Adobe Photographer package for $9.95 a month, or if you have the school version, it comes with Photoshop and Lightroom. But you do have to install it. So if you haven't installed Photoshop yet, then you're just going to have to watch until you install it. But I'm going to show you how it works here. So I'm going to right click with my mouse on this photograph. Okay. When I right click, I'm going to get a menu that pops up with some options here. I want to go down to the one that's sort of here at the top. It says edit in. Okay. And then this one, I'm going to use this option that says edit in Adobe Photoshop 2020. Okay, yours might say 2021. All right, so I'm going to click on that. And then another menu will pop up. And this one is important because this is going to determine whether or not when I save in Photoshop, does it save a copy back into my Lightroom catalog as a TIFF file. Okay, so the one we want to use is we want to use the one on the top. In fact, I would rarely, if ever, recommend these two other things. And if I have time, maybe I'll explain why you would want to use them. But 99% of the time, I'm going to be using this top option. Okay. And this says edit a copy with the Lightroom adjustments. Okay. And that basically, if I have a photograph that I've already made adjustments in Lightroom, when I bring it into Photoshop, those adjustments will be present. I'll be able to see them. And then when it gets saved back to Lightroom, it saves it back with my new adjustments and my previous adjustments. All right. So I want to use that top option right there, edit a copy with the Lightroom adjustments. So press the edit button and give it a second. If you don't have Photoshop open, it's going to go and launch Photoshop. So it might take a second for it to open up Photoshop, and then it's going to open in Photoshop. Hopefully. Mine's not doing anything. There we go. Okay. It took a while. It was kind of slow. Mine was already open too. I don't know why it took so long to open. I'll give you guys a sec just in case anybody's taking a long time. Okay, so now that I have this photograph open in Photoshop, okay, I'm not going to go into detail about the layers and all that other stuff. If you've taken Photoshop before, you'll kind of understand some of this stuff. And if you haven't, I recommend that you do take at least Photoshop 1 or the entry-level class, because it's really nice to have those extra little skills. If you're a photographer, you're probably going to be doing most of your editing in Lightroom, but there are going to be some instances where you'll want to take a photo from Lightroom, like in this case, and bring it into Photoshop and do something here that wasn't available in Lightroom. One of the biggest advantages of Photoshop that Lightroom doesn't have is the ability to create layers, right? We can create layers in Photoshop, and because of that, I can do all kinds of things that I can't do in Lightroom. For instance, if I wanted to take this person and select them and move them over and add another person to this photo and then save it as one photo, I could do that. But I wouldn't be able to add somebody to a photo in Lightroom because it doesn't support layers, right? So there's other advantages to Photoshop that Lightroom won't have. For doing your basic stuff, it's great. But when you want to get into more like graphic design and doing more specific things, then you're going to have some of these little Photoshop skills. Okay, so this one's going to be easy though. So all we need to do is come up to the top up here where the menu is, and we're going to go to a filter. We're going to click on the filter. And if we scroll down here, we're going to go down to where it says noise. And you'll notice that there are some options here, and one of the options, don't click this yet, but one of the options is reduce noise. That's exactly basically the same thing that's available in Lightroom. We tried reducing the noise and it didn't work, right? We didn't get any effect here, right? So the one that we want to use here that's different than the reduced noise is dust and scratches. This is going to give me a broader heel where it's going to go and look at larger things that may be on the photograph, like scratches or a bunch of dust or anything that like this aging that we have here in this photo. So choose dust and scratches. Now, if you're using Photoshop for the first time, I can't remember what the default number is here, but mine is about 9 and 9 on the radius and the threshold. Okay, so yours might be a little bit different. So just grab that radius slider and you can slide it back and you can see that 1 basically is applying no effect hardly at all. And as I increase the radius and I start increasing it, it's going to slowly start to eliminate those little marks, right? And I can see a big difference when I hit about 7 or 8. I can really see the difference. Okay. Now, if I increase my radius even more, it will definitely get rid of those marks, but look what's happening. It'll also make the photo very blurry. Okay, so you've got to find that kind of happy medium where you're eliminating the scratches and the dust, in this case, the repeating pattern, without making your photo blurry. So I'm going to back that radius off. And I thought it looked pretty good right around 7 or 8. So I'm gonna put it at 8 on the radius. So what about this threshold? What does this threshold do? Well, if I increase the threshold, what's going to happen is you can see that the pattern will start to come back, right? But I do get a little more sharpness in the photo, right? So if I go all the way on the threshold, basically at its highest level, then really no effect is being applied, okay? So I can see that I just brought the pattern back. So I want to reduce the threshold, okay, to a point to where I'm happy that it's eliminating that pattern, but yet I still have some sharpness still in the photo, like in the shadows and the highlights. And basically, that's kind of what it's doing here is looking at the shadows, like say the hair compared to the highlights on the face. And it's trying to adjust these areas to maintain sharpness in the photo, but trying to get rid of that pattern. So I'm going to drop this down. And by the way, you have a little preview window up here that you can see it's at 100%. So let's say if I click here, I can go right to the face. So I'm seeing a zoomed in version here, and I'm seeing the regular version here. But to see the effect take place in this little window, I have to click and hold with my mouse. And then when I let go, I see the effect. So if I click and hold, you can see the pattern comes back. That's before. And I let go, and that's after. Okay, before and after, before and after. So just in this little window right here. But if I want to see the effect taking place out here, I've got the little preview button that I can turn off, which will show me my before out here, and then after, before and after. Okay, so I have 2 areas that I can preview, either the zoomed in preview right here or my full screen or my full preview right here. So I'm going to drop that threshold down. I still am seeing, I don't like the pattern in her face. I can see it right here. So I'm going to lower that a little bit more. I could also raise the radius up if I want, and that could help. But I think I'm going to, no, I'm not liking that. It's looking too blurry. So I'm going to go back to where I was at, 8, and I'll drop the threshold down. I'm going to put it at about 5. That looks pretty good. And I might just I'm going to bump the radius up to 9. Okay. So now this isn't going to completely eliminate everything perfectly, right? So we want to make sure that you're happy with the results, right? We're trying to make an improvement here, but in some cases I might have to run, another filter on this to get it to be perfect, or I'd have to go in and enhance certain things here. Actually, you know what? I am going to back that back off. I'm not happy with that because it's getting too blurry. So I am going to drop that radius a little bit more. I think I'm going to go back to 8 or maybe even 7. I'm still seeing a little bit of that pattern, but you know what? It has made a huge difference. So you're going to have to be the judge. Like I said, it's kind of splitting the difference between getting rid of the pattern, the repeated pattern, and maintaining some sharpness in the photo. Because obviously what this is trying to do to get rid of the pattern is it's trying to blur the pattern, you know. So I'm gonna keep it right there. I've got it at 8 and 5. Yours could be a little bit different. If you did 7 and 5, that would be fine too. And then we can see our before and after here. All right, so I'm going to click OK and apply that. So that's been applied. That filter's been applied. Now, if I wanted to, I can continue to edit here in Photoshop, and I can get rid of some of these bigger blotches and a few other little things, and maybe even increase the sharpness. But I'm not going to do that because I can actually do that in Lightroom, right? I can do non-destructive editing in Lightroom, where if I do it here, anything I do in Photoshop is going to be a permanent part of this picture. So I'm going to stop right here because this is all I want to be permanent, and then I'll do the non-destructive edits in Lightroom. So here's a very important step. In order to get this photo back into Lightroom with these changes, I have to save it. But you've got to make sure you do it correctly, because if you don't do it right, it isn't going to save it back. So what you want to do is you just want to go up here to where it says File, and you hit Save. Don't hit Save As, right? Because what we're doing is we're basically saving this, and it's going to go back to Lightroom. So do Command S or Save, but don't do Save As where it asks you where you want to save it, right? Just hit this one right here, or Command S. Okay, so save, and now it's saving it. Okay, now I'm going to go back over to Lightroom. So I'll minimize Photoshop, and I'll go back into Lightroom here. And there we go. We can see that down here in the film strip, down at the bottom, I now have 2 photos. I have 1 of 2 and 2 of 2, right? So I have 1 of 2 and 2 of 2. So here on the first one, you can see that it says scan-edit.tiff. So what happened is Photoshop saved it back into Lightroom as a TIFF. And that's usually the file that gets generated by Photoshop when it gets saved back into Lightroom, because TIFFs can maintain quality unlike a JPEG, because JPEGs are compressed. Remember, JPEGs are compressed. I had that handout that I gave you to explain the difference between the different file formats. And remember, a TIFF can actually be saved with no compression. And that's why Photoshop chooses this particular file format to save it back into Lightroom. Okay. All right, cool. So I still have my original. My original's still right here. And now I have my TIFF, which is my edited version that came straight from Photoshop. I didn't have to re-import it or nothing. It just saved straight back to Lightroom really, really easily. Okay, so let me fit this to screen so we can see that. So I've got a few other little things that I'd like to do to this photo now. It definitely has made a huge improvement getting rid of all that pattern, but I still would like to kind of sharpen it up a little bit more. And I also want to take care of some of these other like spots here, like that big spot right there. Maybe this one over here on the left. There's a big black spot here. And the edges, right? The edges of the photo also have kind of that little sort of like white. Let me see that. Yeah, see right here, this little white kind of bleed. So maybe I want to take care of that by like cropping that out or something. Okay. So I'm going to take this photo and I'm going to bring it into, oh, I'm in the develop module. Sorry. So make sure you're in the develop module. Okay. And not in the library, because I want to use that spot removal tool. Okay, we did this one when we were doing the touch up on the faces and stuff previously. So I'm going to grab the spot removal tool, which is the second tool from the left. Our first tool is the crop tool, and our second tool is the spot removal tool. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and remember how this tool works is that when I click on a spot, I make my brush just a little bit bigger than the spot, and then I'll click it, and then Lightroom's going to go and choose an area to cover up the spot. But the last time we used this tool, guys, we were playing with the opacity. This is an important lesson right here because Lightroom always remembers the last thing that you did, and it keeps your tool set to those settings. So in this case, I just clicked on that spot to try to get rid of it, and it didn't get rid of it. Well, the reason why is because if I look over here at my brush, right, on that particular spot, the opacity is at 52%. So I want to increase the opacity, see here, so that it's 100%. So it's covering it up 100%. I also want to make sure that I'm using the healing and not the cloning. Healing is the one that you're going to use a majority of the time because what it does is it actually clones and then blends. So it's doing two things rather than just making a direct copy. You're getting that blending when you choose healing. So it's going to make things a lot easier for you. There are some rare occasions when we want to clone, and I might have a lesson coming up shortly here where we will be doing some cloning, but in most cases, the healing is what you want. Okay. So there. So now that's completely eliminated that. So I'll move over here then. And I'm going to, let me go back to here. I want to get rid of this guy here. So I'm going to brush over this area like that. And then it goes and chooses another area. See? So you can not only just click, but you can also brush like a larger area. And I want to get rid of that little black spot. So I just keep my hand on the little wheel, the scroll wheel, or you can use the bracket keys to increase. Left bracket key, right bracket key will increase and decrease the size of your brush. So I'll just click once on that little spot, and that shows a good area. That looks fine. Okay, let me zoom back out. I'm going to fit this to the screen because I can't see if there's any other big spots. Those are the three main ones. There's a little one up here that I might just zoom in and see if I can get rid of that. Yeah, I'll just brush over like this area. And that looks pretty good. I think I'm going to crop this, so I'm not really worried about those ones on the outer edge, but I got rid of that one also. Okay, so fit to screen.
Brady, how do you get the hand so that you can move it?
It's only going to show up when you're zoomed in. Okay, so you have to be zoomed in, like say 300% or 3:1, right? And when I'm zoomed in, I hold the space bar down on my keyboard, and then I get the hand, and then I can move around at that zoom level.
Okay.
But if I'm not zoomed in, like if I'm at fit to screen, then the hand's not available to me. And sometimes if I'm at fill, yeah, well, it's available there. It just depends on how big your screen is as well. But as long as you're zoomed in where you can't see the whole entire photograph, then when you hold the space bar down, the hand should be available for you.
Okay, thank you.
So Brady, can you use that skin smoothing on this to get rid of some of that texture?
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I was actually going to do is show you how we can use that skin smoothing on there. So the spots look pretty good. Okay, I've got those taken care of now. So what I want to do, and before I get to that skin smoothing and doing some of that stuff, is first I want to sort of edit the photograph overall and sort of just clean it up in the basic panel first. Because sometimes when we add contrast or we adjust the whites and the blacks sliders, we might bring back some of that, you know, pattern because we're enhancing it. And then I can go in and then I can kind of smooth the skin out a little bit in those areas as well. All right, so I'm done with this brush. Okay, I'm done with this brush, so I'm going to hit done. And I want to eliminate the little white line on the outside here on the bottom and the left. And I could have done that in Photoshop, and most likely I probably would have, but I want to show you how you can do it here and do it non-destructively, so that in case you want to make it bigger or come back to it, you can do it again. So the easiest way for me to get rid of a line that's going down the right-hand side is just to crop the photo, okay? So I'm gonna go to my crop tool, which is the first tool underneath your histogram on the left, the very first tool. So we're gonna hit the crop tool here. And you'll see that the crop tool will have a little lock on it, okay? And it should say original. Okay, this means that it's not going to allow me to change the aspect ratio. So basically, if I'm moving, see, the aspect ratio doesn't change. The aspect ratio is the width to height. Remember, that's not the physical size, but that's the width to height ratio. So I could change this if I want to change the aspect ratio, but in most cases, I probably don't. So I'm going to leave it on the original, and I'm going to leave the lock on. That way, when I move this around and I move this, that the aspect ratio is going to stay the same. So my goal here is just to kind of reduce the size a little bit to eliminate those edges, but I want to maintain the same height and width, right? So I'm just going to move this in just a little bit, like maybe right there. So I'm just basically going to crop a little bit of the edges out. Okay, you can go more if you want, but in this case, I just want a little bit. So just like that there. Okay, once you've cropped that in now and you've got this in position, you can hit done down here in the lower right. Okay, and now you can see the little white lines that were once there are gone, but our photo is the same aspect ratio, height to width. And we didn't actually take away that much in the photo either. We just took a little bit off the edges, right? Using the crop tool. Okay. So here's another little trick when you're working with these old black and white photos. Problem can be that they might age and they might actually be a little yellow looking or something, right? They could kind of look like this, right? Or they could have more red in them. I've seen a lot of photos like this. And that's just because the paper will fade and the acids in the paper can change the color in that old film, right? So there's not a whole lot you can do about it. And when it comes to the color balance, well, we can't really use these color sliders, the tint and stuff like that, because there's really no color in the photograph, right? We basically got this kind of, well, there actually is color in there. There's color channels, but the saturation isn't spread out across all the pixels like it would be in a normal color photograph. So I could add a tint if I wanted to. And sometimes this doesn't look bad. So if I add like a little blue here, you know, something like that, I can give it sort of this sort of bluish look. Or if I want to give it more of an old photo look, I can give it kind of what's called a sepia tone. And that would basically be by adding a little bit of yellow like that, and then a little bit of red. And then that sort of gives me that little sepia tone. But here's what I do sometimes is that if my photo has a color cast to it, I just want it to look black and white. Okay? I don't want any color in there whatsoever. I do have an option of clicking on the black and white button right here, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently. I'm not going to click on the black and white button because then these other adjustments won't be available to me. If I click on black and white, then I won't be able to go in here and make certain adjustments. They'll be grayed out. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go down to the saturation slider way down at the bottom in the presence. And I'm going to reduce the color saturation, all right, to -100. I'm going to take all the color out, right? Because your photo might look yellowish or reddish. And so this is just a really quick way to take that down so there's no color saturation, right? There we go. So all the way down to minus 100. Now it's just black and white, nice and clean, no color over it whatsoever. And I still have all of these sliders that are available to me to adjust, right? Okay. So now the temperature and tint doesn't really do much other than making it darker or lighter. But I'm going to put these back to 0. And remember that these little sliders here, if you want to get them back to 0 because you're having trouble doing it, just double click on the name, right? Double click on temperature, that'll take it to 0. Double click on tint, that'll take it to 0. And now I'm right back to square one right here. But now I have no color saturation in the photo. It's just black and white. Okay, so I want to enhance this a little bit here with this basic panel. It's lacking a little contrast, although the whites are very bright. They're very strong. Okay. So I'm going to do that little trick that I showed you guys about opening up the photo, right? The dynamic range. I can do it here on this photo as well. So I'm going to take the highlight slider and I'm going to move the highlights down. And you can see by doing that, I'm starting to get more detail in the face. It's less blown out. And I don't think I'm going to go all the way to minus 100. But I am going to reduce it quite a bit. And this is subjective, but let's see. I think I'm going to go right around minus 60 or so. Minus 60, minus 70, right in that range there. Well, let's do minus 60. Okay. And then in the blacks, if I take the shadow, if I move the shadow, let's see what this does. If I move the shadow out, I guess I can see a little more detail in that hair when I'm doing that. But the image starts to get kind of flat looking. It's really starting to lose contrast. Well, that's okay. I'm going to bring it back here in a second. So let's move the shadows out. And let's see, where do we want to put this? Probably about the same. So probably like a plus 60 then. Okay. So I got minus 60 on the highlights and a plus 60 on the shadows. I've opened it up. I'm seeing more in the highlight. I'm seeing more in the shadow. But now my image is kind of flat looking. I've lost some contrast. So this is where I want to set the white point and the black point, the brightest point of the photo and the darkest point of the photo, right? That's where I'm going to set that to get that contrast back. So grab the white slider and we're going to move this to a point. We're going to look at our histogram here and we're going to make sure that that information doesn't creep up the wall there on the right side, right? So make sure you don't get something like that, right? So we're going to back that to just where it kind of touches the wall. So maybe right about there. That's like a plus 40. Okay, that looks good. And now we set the black point. This is really going to bring in the contrast. So I grab the black slider, okay, and I'll move that over until it's sort of touching the wall, but I don't want it creeping up the wall. I want to back it off. I think I'm going to back it off a little bit more because it seems like it's adding too much contrast there. And this is going to be subjective based on how you want your photo to look. So I'm going to do about a minus 60 on the black. Okay, so we're done with the tonal adjustment. That looks pretty good. I'm going to go down to the presence now, and we're going to talk about texture and clarity. Now, here's the thing where if I'm going to add texture, and I warned you guys before, like adding texture to someone's face on a portrait is probably not a good idea, because if I add texture, it helps on the blouse and the hair, but now in the background and the face, it's not looking good, right? So we actually could back off the texture a tiny bit, and that's going to help smooth things out. But I wouldn't go too far because it's going to start to look blurry, right? We don't want that. So if I'm going to back off the texture, I'm just going to be very subtle with it, like a -5, something very, very subtle. All right, so now I'm going to take the clarity And this is going to help increase detail in the midtones. So I'm just going to move that back and forth and just see what it does here. All right, so once again on this one, I'm just going to do a little bit of clarity, just a tiny bit. So like a plus 15, plus 20. I don't think I'd go much further than that. Okay. Now the vibrance isn't going to work because the saturation is 0, right? Remember we took this, that was the first thing we did is we took that saturation out. But that's entirely up to you. If you do want your photo to have sort of that brownish sepia tone look, then add the saturation back in and play with the temperature and tint. Okay, but in this case, I just want it to be pure black and white. So that's why I've got my saturation at minus 100. All right, I'm going to hit my Y key so I can see the before and after here. Okay, so this is the before when it came out of Photoshop. Remember, it's not the before on the original that had all those little marks on it, because you can see that the before here doesn't have those little marks because this photo came, this was the TIFF that came out of Photoshop. But you can see the difference now. What we've done here is we've taken out that sort of yellow tone to it. We've added some contrast. We got rid of those spots, and so it's looking pretty nice. So a couple of things I can do, and we're kind of running out of time here. And one of the things, and Susan made a good suggestion, was if I wanted to go in and use the adjustment brush, I can go in and do the skin softening here, right? And just do it on the face. So that would help get rid of that little pattern even more on the skin. I would probably leave it on like the background just for texture or something. But if I had time, I would go into my adjustment brush and then use the preset for the skin softening and just brush over, and that would clean up all of this little pattern on her face here. All right, but we want, if you want to do that after class, you can, but we won't have time to do it. The last thing I might do is try to bring a little sharpness around the edges of the face and the eyes. And so I would go to the detail panel. I would slide down here and go to the detail panel. And let me get out of this view. I'm going to hit the Y key to get out of that dual view there. So here in the detail panel, I'd add some sharpening. Okay, so I'd add some sharpening, and I'm just going to slide the slider to about 100 for now. Okay, but remember probably the best thing about the sharpening in Lightroom is the masking slider. Right? Remember, the masking slider allows me to just determine where the sharpening happens rather than doing the entire photo everywhere. I'm going to use the masking. So when I click the masking slider and as I start to slide it over to the right, if I hold my Option or Alt key down, right, on my keyboard, then I'm going to get this view. Whatever you see in white is being sharpened. Whatever you see in black is not being sharpened, all right? So rather than having everything sharpen up like that, right, I'm going to narrow the sharpening down to just the edges on this particular one. So you can see here, like maybe right about there, I'll get some sharpness around the eyes, around the head and the hair, around the lips and nose, and also around some of the patterns on the top there, right? I could back it off a little bit, maybe like that. I don't want to go too far because then I'm losing lots. So I'm going to go, let's see what that looks like. I'm going to go probably around an 80, 85-ish, right in that range there. There we go. Okay. And then I'm going to increase the sharpening a little bit more than 100. I'm going to go up further here. Let me see if I can make this. I usually don't like going all the way on these sliders, but I'm going to do about a 135. So that's really pushing it. But let's see what that looks like when I turn the little on and off switch on the detail panel right here. So I'll turn it off. I'll turn it on. It's pretty subtle. Let me zoom in here. Yeah, you can see it more as you zoom in. You can see that kind of taking effect around there. but I'm not actually. It's definitely adding some texture around those areas. I think I want to back it off a little bit though, even though it's hard to see when I'm zoomed out, because what if I wanted to print this photo? I don't like that it's added. In this case here, I'm going to increase the radius, right? The radius is the amount of pixels that get affected with the sharpening. So the sharpening happens between areas of high contrast where light meets dark. So the radius right now is, the default is set to 1 pixel, meaning it's going to add 1 pixel of contrast around these areas. So I'm going to open it up a little bit on this one. I kind of liked how it was looking when I went to about 2 pixels. So I'm going to go to 2 pixels, and that's going to open up the sharpening. It looks a little bit more natural. And then if I turn on and off, there's before and after. Yeah, I like that better. Before and after. Before and after. Okay, great. So I'll go back to fit to screen. This is looking pretty good. If I hit my Y key, I can see my before and after here. And the last thing I would probably do would go in, like we were saying, and using the adjustment brush and doing the softened skin just on the skin, not on the hair, you know, not on the lips, not on the eyes, but just on the skin portion like we did previously. Okay. All right, guys. So it's 12:09. So just want to make sure you guys put your name in the chat room for today's attendance if you haven't already done it. And if you have any last minute questions, go ahead and ask now. But that's how you do a basic quick edit in Photoshop when Lightroom's noise reduction isn't working. You use the dust and scratch in Photoshop. That's a really cool feature. I'm going to go over some of these other photos in here too that we'll be working on probably tomorrow as well. So we'll be doing a couple of other quick edits. So we'll go back over this again. Hey, Connie, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, okay. Did you notice anybody that came in for the open
No,
house thing?
no, didn't see nobody. I was looking and looking, but I don't see nobody like.
Yeah, that's weird. They didn't like our class. There was see if you look here, there's a under the participants window, there is one that says OH for open house.
But
I don't know if
but
there's
I don't
anybody
know about
there,
it.
if that's just a general login that somebody did, or
Maybe one of the secretaries or something like
yeah,
that. I
maybe.
don't know. Could be.
Yeah. I had the waiting room turned off so anybody could just come in, you know.
Yeah, they also send an email because you was in lecture. They just send the email. Pauline sent the email. Let me see. It's like for the open house, but
Oh,
I
okay.
think it's for everybody. But that's it. She didn't say anything. She just sent it to everybody, to all the secretaries, and yeah. So yeah, that's all.
Okay. Well, that was that then.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Okay.
And I
All
think
right.
for this open house that you say it, that's I think just the link that she sent it, because I see it right here.
Yeah, it's just basically a link that anybody could go into and check it. Now, the only thing I'm concerned about is if they sent the link out to our Zoom class to a bunch of people, are they going to be able to use that link to come back into our class like this next week and so on? I don't know.
Oh, you're right.
So it might be good if I just change the link and send out a new link for the remainder of the class, maybe for tomorrow and the next week, and then we'll see. I'll think about it. I'll see what they did. Maybe they sent out
it.
yeah. So I
Yeah,
might
but
be
you're right. You're right, because they can go in the.
yeah,
they
can
send the link.
now that everybody's got a link, right? They can just come in at any
Yes.
time, you know. So
Yeah.
we'll see. I'll see
We'll
if they did it differently or whatever. But
Okay, so tomorrow maybe I'm going to check the numbers, because usually that's the same number that we have it doing in the morning.
yeah.
Okay.
All right. All right, guys. Well, cool. So it's 12:12, so I'm getting out of here. If you're in Photoshop, I'll see you in a few minutes. And if not, I'll see you back here tomorrow. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. Where is that button? Okay.
Thank you.